On my 60th birthday, I stood in the doorway of my daughter's ostentatious living room, a fresh, ugly bruise blooming like a poisoned flower around my left eye. The chatter, the forced laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, it all stopped. Every head turned. Silence descended like a shroud. Then my daughter Crystal, my Crystal, her voice ringing with a horrifying misplaced pride that cracked the very foundation of my heart, announced to her stunned guests, "Oh, it was my husband. He taught her some respect. Marcus, my esteemed son-in-law, the man who had put the bruise there, just smirked beside her. That smirk. Vile. Triumphant. It was the last moment of peace he'd know for a very long time, because seconds later, unseen by them, my brother Charles walked through the front door behind me, and everything changed. Let me tell you how a birthday party meant to celebrate my life turned into a funeral for theirs. Let me tell you who they thought I was. The quiet, compliant, slightly pathetic widow. And let me tell you who I really am. Because they had no idea. None at all. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let's start. First, let me tell you who I really am, beyond a simple label of Mom or Vivian. For 35 years I was Vivian Johnson, principal of Jefferson Middle School. Not just a principal, but the principal. I ran that school like a tight ship, navigating stormy seas. I dealt with volatile teenagers hormonal enough to power a small city, ambitious teachers jostling for position, demanding parents convinced their child was a misunderstood genius, and labyrinthine school board politics that would make Machiavelli take notes. I managed budgets that were perpetually inadequate, stretched thin by bureaucratic waste and societal neglect. I mediated conflicts, enforced discipline, celebrated triumphs and mourned tragedies. I did it all with a quiet determination, a firm sense of justice, and a backbone forged in the relentless fire of public education. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't lucrative, but it was meaningful. It was my life's work. Before that, and during much of it, I was simply Vivian, wife to Samuel, the kindest, gentlest man I ever knew. He was a mechanic, good with his hands, better with his heart. He died young, a sudden brutal heart attack when Crystal was just 10, leaving me alone to navigate the choppy waters of single parenthood on a principal's modest salary. Those were hard years. Years of working late, grading papers after Crystal was asleep, taking on extra summer school duties to pay for braces or ballet lessons. Years of stretching every dollar until it screamed, of patching worn clothes, of driving old cars, of sacrificing my own small comforts so that she, my bright, beautiful daughter, could have every opportunity, every advantage I could possibly engineer for her. My life revolved around her, ensuring she had the best education, shielding her from the harsh realities of our tight budget, instilling in her the values Samuel and I held dear: integrity, hard work, kindness, the importance of character over cash. I thought I had succeeded. She excelled in school, went to a good college funded by scholarships I helped her research and loans. I quietly co-signed, and landed a respectable job in customer relations. Then came Marcus Moore. He swept into her life like a conquering hero, all flashy suits, expensive car leased I suspected, and booming confidence. He was a regional sales manager for some company selling something vaguely technical, and he projected an aura of success that dazzled my daughter. She, who had always felt slightly insecure about our modest background, saw him as her ticket to a different, better, shinier world. They married quickly. I had reservations. Marcus seemed dismissive, arrogant beneath the charm, overly concerned with appearances, but Crystal was blinded by love, or perhaps by ambition. I held my tongue. She was an adult. It was her choice. After my retirement 2 years ago, the dynamic shifted. My quiet, paid-off bungalow, the one Samuel and I had poured our hearts into, suddenly became too much house for me alone. Or so they claimed. "Mom, you shouldn't be rattling around in that big place all by yourself," Crystal insisted, her voice full of performative concern. "It's not safe. And think of the upkeep. Why don't you sell it and come stay with us? We've got plenty of room. It would be easier for everyone. We can help take care of you." Jamal, sorry Marcus, readily agreed, likely seeing the potential financial benefits. "Yeah, Viv," he'd said, already dropping the formal Mrs. Johnson. "Great idea. Sell that old place while the market's hot. Put the cash somewhere safe. Come relax with us. Help out with the grandkids a bit. It'll be perfect. Help out with the grandkids." That was the hook. I adored my grandchildren, Maya and Dion, even if they were already showing alarming signs of inheriting their parents' materialism. The thought of being closer to them, of helping Crystal manage the demands of motherhood and her part-time work, was tempting. And the house did feel empty without Samuel. So, against my better judgment, fueled by a mixture of loneliness and a desire to be useful, I agreed. I sold my home, the repository of my entire married life, putting the substantial proceeds into my already healthy and entirely secret investment accounts funded by decades of meticulous saving, frugal living, and those surprisingly lucrative tech stocks my former student had recommended. I told them I'd put the money into safe, low-yield bonds, reinforcing their image of me as financially naive and dependent. I moved into their large, ostentatious house in the suburbs with 2 suitcases and a heart full of uneasy hope. The hope wouldn't last long. The unease, however, would prove tragically prescient. My status in Crystal and Marcus's household shifted with astonishing speed from cherished mother needing support to tolerated slightly burdensome long-term guest. The initial performance of welcome faded quickly, replaced by the grating reality of their daily lives. The guest room I was given wasn't terrible, but it certainly wasn't the welcoming haven Crystal had implied. It was the smallest of the 4 upstairs bedrooms, overlooking the noisy street rather than the manicured backyard. It contained a single twin bed, clearly salvaged from one of the children's previous room configurations, and a small cheap particle board dresser. The ensuite bathroom was shared with the hallway. It was clean, yes, but stark, impersonal, and utterly devoid of any welcoming touches. It wasn't a guest room, it was storage space temporarily repurposed for inconvenient human cargo. Still, I tried. I unpacked my few belongings, tried to make the small space feel like home with a few photos and books, and attempted to settle into the rhythm of their lives. It was immediately apparent that I was a foreign object, disrupting the carefully calibrated ecosystem of their household. Tiffany, no Crystal, and Kevin, no Marcus lived lives dictated by schedules and appearances. Their mornings were a frantic rush of Peloton rides, green smoothies blended with the roar of a jet engine, and getting the children, Maya 10 and Dion 8, dressed in miniature versions of their parents' designer athleisure wear for school. Their evenings were a blur of client dinners for Marcus, late nights ostensibly working for Crystal, though often just scrolling social media, and homework battles with children who seemed constitutionally opposed to any activity that didn't involve a screen. I, the retired principal accustomed to structure and purpose, felt utterly adrift. I tried to find ways to contribute to ease their burden, to earn my keep in this temporary arrangement. I'd wake early, make coffee, tidy the kitchen that always seemed to be in a state of low-grade chaos despite the twice-weekly cleaning service. I'd offer to help the children with their homework, drawing on my decades of experience managing adolescent attention spans. My efforts were consistently subtly rebuffed. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to do that," Crystal would say, intercepting me as I reached for a sponge. "Consuela handles the kitchen, just relax." The implication was clear. "You'll just mess up her system." When I tried to help Maya with her math homework, explaining a concept using a method that had worked for thousands of middle schoolers, Crystal swooped in. "Mom, that's the old way," she'd said brightly, pushing me aside. "Her tutor uses a new, holistic approach. It's much more efficient." Translation: your outdated knowledge is useless here. Even simple acts of grandmotherly affection were met with awkwardness. When I tried to hug Dion, he squirmed away, complaining that my sweater was scratchy. Maya would roll her eyes if I asked about her day, preferring to communicate via sarcastic one-word answers while scrolling through TikTok. They weren't hostile. Not exactly. They were just indifferent. I was an irrelevant figure from a different, less interesting world. I spent most of my time confined to my small room, reading, watching the curated perfection of their lives unfold from a distance. I ate meals alone more often than not, picking at leftovers while they attended catered events or ordered expensive takeout. I wasn't invited to share. The feeling of being an intruder intensified daily. I wasn't a grieving mother being cared for by her loving family. I was an awkward, inconvenient piece of furniture they kept bumping into, unsure of where to put me but increasingly certain they didn't want me in the main living areas. The house wasn't a home, it was a minefield of unspoken rules and simmering resentments, and I was navigating it alone, without an ally. The incident itself, the one that led to the ugly bruise blooming like a poisonous nightshade around my eye, wasn't a dramatic, drawn-out fight involving hurled accusations or slammed doors. It was much quicker, uglier and more revealing than that. It was a sudden shocking flare-up of Marcus's simmering resentment and fragile ego, ignited by a trivial spark, fanned by his own arrogance, and ultimately enabled by Crystal's terrified, complicit silence. It happened 2 days before the farcical birthday party they were planning for me, but not about me. I was in the kitchen, a large gleaming expanse of stainless steel and granite, that always felt more like a laboratory than a place for family meals. I was quietly making myself a cup of tea, trying my best to stay out of the way. Marcus and Crystal were bustling around, radiating tension, preparing for some important client dinner they were hosting that evening. The air was thick with unspoken stress, and Marcus's barely contained irritation. He was on the phone, pacing back and forth across the polished floor like a caged tiger, loudly berating someone, likely a subordinate at his sales company, about a missed quarterly target or a lost account. His voice was sharp, laced with contempt, bouncing off the hard, unforgiving surfaces of the kitchen. Absolutely unacceptable. I don't pay you people to make excuses. I pay you for results. You fix it, understand? Fix it, or you're gone. He slammed the phone down onto the granite countertop with unnecessary violent force, the crack echoing in the large room, making me jump and spilling a bit of hot water on my hand. He turned, his face flushed a deep angry red, his eyes narrowed with residual fury, and his hostile gaze landed immediately, almost magnetically, on me. Perhaps he simply needed a new, closer target for his frustration. Perhaps my quiet, unassuming presence in his kitchen simply annoyed him on a fundamental level. "What are you still doing down here, Brenda?" he snapped, his voice rough, discarding even the thin pretense of politeness he sometimes employed. "Shouldn't you be in your room by now? We have important guests arriving soon. We need this space clear. Functional." He gestured vaguely around the kitchen, implying my mere existence was disrupting its function. The sheer, unadulterated rudeness of it, the blatant dismissal of my right to simply exist in the house, stung sharply. But 40 years of de-escalating conflicts, with angry parents, defiant students, stressed-out teachers, kicked in automatically. "I was just making myself a cup of tea, Marcus," I said calmly, holding up my mug as evidence. "I'll be out of your way in just a moment." My voice was quiet, non-confrontational. "Make it quick," he grumbled, turning his back, already dismissing me again, reaching up to open one of the high overhead cabinet doors, searching perhaps for a specific type of glass or liquor for his guests. As I reached across the counter for the sugar bowl, intending to make that quick retreat he demanded, my hand inadvertently brushed against a tall, ridiculously precarious stack of expensive-looking crystal wine glasses he had just unboxed and left teetering dangerously near the edge. One of the delicate, long-stemmed glasses wobbled precariously. Instinctively, reflexively, I reached out my other hand to steady the stack, to prevent it from crashing to the floor. My movement, however small, startled Marcus, who was still reaching into the open cabinet above. He spun around, his face contorted with a sudden disproportionate rage. "Don't touch those," he roared, his voice exploding in the confined space. "They're riddle. They cost a damn fortune." He lunged forward, not at me necessarily, but certainly towards the precious glasses, his hand shooting out protectively to grab them before my supposedly clumsy, contaminating touch could damage them. In his haste, his anger, his alcohol-fueled overreaction, he misjudged the distance, the angle, the trajectory. His forearm, hard and unyielding, slammed violently into my shoulder, knocking me completely off balance. I stumbled backwards, gasping, my hip hitting the sharp, unforgiving granite corner of the massive kitchen island with a sickening thud. The impact jarred my entire body, sending a jolt of white-hot pain up my side. My head snapped back from the force in the pointed corner of the open overhead cabinet door, the very door he had carelessly left open just moments before, connected sharply, brutally, with my left cheekbone just below the eye. Pain exploded behind my eye, sharp, blinding, nauseating. Stars, literal stars, flickered in my vision. I staggered, clutching instinctively at my face, a small, involuntary gasp escaping my lips. The world seemed to tilt and swim for a moment. Marcus froze mid-lunge, his hand still outstretched towards the now stable, perfectly safe wine glasses. He looked at me, clutching my face, then up at the offending cabinet door, then back at me. His anger seemed to momentarily evaporate, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Shock? Perhaps. Fear of consequences. More likely, genuine concern or remorse. Absolutely not. Crystal, who had witnessed the entire shocking, split-second incident from the dining room doorway where she'd been arranging flowers, rushed forward, But her path wasn't towards me, her injured mother. It was directly, instinctively, protectively towards Marcus. "Oh my God, honey, are you okay?" she cried, her voice trembling, her hands fluttering anxiously over his arm, his chest, as if he were the one who had just been assaulted. "I'm fine, get off me," he snapped, shaking her off impatiently, his eyes still fixed on me, his mind clearly rapidly constructing the narrative, shifting the blame. She startled me, came out of nowhere. She almost knocked over the damn glasses. Could have broken the whole set. He was already painting me as the aggressor, the clumsy, interfering old woman who had caused her own injury through sheer incompetence. "Mom?" Crystal finally turned her attention to me, her face pale, her eyes wide now, not with concern for my well-being, but with a mixture of raw fear and undisguised annoyance. "Are you all right? What happened? Did you fall?" She was already offering me the pre-packaged excuse, the socially acceptable lie. "He hit me," I whispered, the words feeling thick, unreal in my own mouth. My voice trembled slightly, less from pain now and more from the sheer soul-crushing shock of the situation, of their immediate reflexive denial and blame-shifting. I touched the rapidly swelling, throbbing flesh beneath my eye. It was already tender, hot to the touch. "I did not hit you," Marcus roared, his face flushing a deep, ugly red again as he realized I wasn't going to play along with the clumsy fall narrative. "Don't you dare say that. You walked right into the open cabinet door. You weren't watching where you were going, clumsy old—" He caught himself just short of the final damning word, but the unspoken insult hung heavy and poisonous in the air between us. "It was an accident, Mom," Crystal said quickly, stepping physically between us now, playing the frantic, desperate peacekeeper, her eyes pleading with me to just drop it, to accept the lie. "Marcus didn't mean it. It happened so fast. You really need to be more careful in the kitchen when things are this busy. Right, honey?" She looked pleadingly, almost subserviently, at Marcus, seeking his validation even now. He just grunted, turning away, already dismissing the incident, as beneath his further notice. He picked up one of the precious Riedel wine glasses and began inspecting it meticulously for microscopic damage. His back pointedly turned towards me. "And Crystal? My daughter?" She looked at my face, at the rapidly darkening, swelling bruise beginning to bloom hideously around my eye, and her expression wasn't one of concern or sympathy or even basic human kindness. It was one of pure, unadulterated annoyance that I had disrupted her perfectly planned evening. Annoyance that I had, through my mere existence, provoked her stressed husband. Annoyance that my undeniable, visible injury was now an inconvenient, ugly reality that clashed violently with the pristine, minimalist aesthetic of her home and her life. "Mom," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent warning hiss, mindful perhaps of the caterers who were due to arrive any minute. "Seriously, you really shouldn't have provoked him like that. You know how stressed he gets before these important client dinners. Please, go upstairs, put some ice on it or something, and please, try not to make a scene tonight when the guests arrive. Don't make a scene." My eye was throbbing violently now. My hip ached where I'd hit the island. My spirit felt bruised, battered, profoundly violated, and her only overriding concern was that my visible injury, the evidence of her husband's aggression, and her own failure to protect me, might embarrass her in front of her important friends. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. What was the point? The verdict had already been rendered. I was the problem, I was the one at fault. I simply turned, clutching my throbbing face, feeling suddenly, deeply, anciently weary, and walked slowly, painfully, out of the gleaming, hostile kitchen and up the stairs to my small, cold room. The bruise began its grotesque bloom, darkening from red to purple, a physical manifestation of their disrespect, their cruelty, their utter lack of basic human empathy, their complete and total moral bankruptcy. It was the final, undeniable proof, etched onto my own skin. I was not safe here. I was not valued. I was simply in the way. And the time for quiet endurance, for polite deflection, for hoping things might somehow get better, was definitively, irrevocably, brutally over. My 60th birthday arrived 2 days later, not with the joyous celebration of 6 decades of life, love and accomplishment that I might have once envisioned, but with a heavy, oppressive sense of dread that settled in my stomach like cold lead. The bruise around my eye had ripened overnight into a truly spectacular, horrifying kaleidoscope of deep purple, angry black and sickly yellow-green. No amount of makeup, even if I owned any beyond a simple tube of lipstick, could possibly have hidden it. It was a stark, ugly, unavoidable testament to the incident in the kitchen, an incident that Crystal and Marcus had completely pointedly ignored for the past 48 hours, pretending it hadn't happened, pretending I didn't exist beyond the closed door of my room. Food appeared silently outside my door on trays, like offerings left for a plague victim. The party they had planned, scheduled to begin at 4 p.m., was, as I had suspected from the hastily assembled guest list, Crystal had carelessly left on the kitchen counter, less a celebration of my milestone birthday, and more a thinly veiled excuse for them to host another social gathering, another opportunity to perform their roles as the successful, generous, well-connected, up-and-coming power couple in their exclusive suburban enclave. The guest list consisted almost entirely of their friends, other couples from their gated community, whose names I vaguely recognized from Crystal's constant chatter, a few of Marcus's smarmy colleagues from the car dealership, some of Crystal's clients from her nebulous social media management work, mostly owners of small, struggling boutiques, I gathered, my own friends, my colleagues from 35 years at Jefferson Middle School, my sister Clarice, who lived 2 states away but would have moved heaven and earth to be here if she'd been invited. None of them had received an invitation. It wasn't my party, I was merely the inconvenient pretext, the birthday girl reduced to a footnote at her own celebration. I had spent the morning secluded in my room, wrestling with the agonizing decision of whether to even appear downstairs. Part of me, the weary, wounded part that just wanted to crawl under the covers and disappear, urged me to stay hidden, lock the door, feign illness, deny them the satisfaction of displaying their burden while simultaneously forcing everyone to pretend the grotesque bruise on my face didn't exist. Why subject myself to the inevitable stares, the whispered speculations, the suffocating weight of their collective pity, or, worse, their silent judgment? But another part, a stubborn, deeply ingrained flicker of the old Principal Jackson, the woman who had never backed down from a difficult assembly, a challenging parent meeting, or a potentially hostile school board review, refused to be erased, refused to be rendered invisible in my own daughter's home, especially not on my birthday. This was my 60th birthday, damn it, a milestone, and more importantly, this house, despite their attempts to claim it, was still filled with the presence of my grandchildren, Maya and Dion. They deserved a grandmother who showed up, who didn't hide, who faced adversity with quiet dignity, even when that adversity came from within their own family. What lesson would I be teaching them if I allowed myself to be bullied into silence, into invisibility? So I made my decision, not out of a desire to confront or create drama, but out of a simple fundamental refusal to be erased. I would appear, I would be present, I would let the bruise speak for itself. Around 3:45 p.m. I stood before the small, cheap mirror above the particle board dresser. The bruise looked even worse in the harsh afternoon light, a swollen, discolored mass covering half my face. I sighed. There was nothing to be done about it. I put on my best simple dress, a navy blue knit I'd owned for years, respectable, understated, the antithesis of the flashy styles favored by Crystal and her friends. I applied a touch of my usual rose-colored lipstick, a small, almost defiant gesture of normalcy, a refusal to completely surrender my identity to the injury. I took a deep, steadying breath, the kind I used to take before stepping onto the stage to address a gymnasium full of restless adolescents. After a difficult incident, I held my head high, ignoring the tremor in my hands that I couldn't quite control, and I walked out of my room to face the performance downstairs. The party was already in full swing, the noise level already approaching unbearable. The house was packed, far more crowded than I had expected, filled with the bright, brittle sound of forced laughter that never quite reached the eyes and the thumping generic beat of some playlist. Marcus undoubtedly curated, the air smelled cloyingly sweet, a mixture of expensive perfume, catered hors d'oeuvres likely involving truffle oil and figs, and perhaps desperation. Crystal was flitting from group to group like a frantic hummingbird, playing the perfect effervescent hostess, her smile dazzling, predatory, her dress undoubtedly new and showcasing a shocking amount of skin for a mother of 2. Marcus was holding court by the oversized, minimalist fireplace, telling some loud, boastful story, involving a ridiculously expensive car to a circle of admiring sycophantic men, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid swirling constantly in his hand. They had clearly decided on their strategy regarding my appearance, complete and utter denial. Ignore the bruise, pretend it wasn't there, act as if everything was perfectly normal. If any guests dared to notice, And how could they possibly not? They would undoubtedly be met with a swift, dismissive deflection from Crystal. "Oh, Mom's just a little clumsy sometimes." Or a cold warning glare from Marcus, shutting down any further inquiry. They were masters of controlling the narrative, of maintaining the perfect, unblemished facade, even when the ugly truth was staring everyone directly in the face. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped fully out of the hallway and into the main living area. My entrance, though quiet, had the effect of a sudden power outage. The nearest conversations faltered first, voices trailing off mid-sentence as eyes flickered towards me, widened slightly, then quickly darted away, pretending not to have seen. A wave of silence, tangible and heavy, began to spread outwards from my position near the staircase, extinguishing the pockets of chatter one by one. The thumping music suddenly seemed offensively loud in the abruptly quiet room. Heads turned, not discreetly but with the open, morbid curiosity of bystanders at the scene of an accident. Eyes scanned my face, lingered for a shocking second on the grotesque multicolored bruise, then flickered away again, landing on Crystal, on Marcus, seeking cues, explanations, desperate for a return to the comfortable, superficial script. By the time I reached the edge of the main gathering space, perhaps 10 feet from the bottom of the stairs, a profound, almost eardrum-popping silence had fallen over the entire room. Every single guest, perhaps 30 or 40 Crystal and Marcus's carefully curated audience, was staring directly at me, or rather at my face, at the stark, ugly, undeniable, unavoidable bruise that dominated my left eye and cheekbone. The music sputtered out as someone, perhaps sensing the catastrophic shift in mood, fumbled with the playlist. The clinking of glasses ceased. Even the ambient murmur of polite social interaction died completely. There was only the sound of collective indrawn breaths, the faint rustle of expensive fabrics as people shifted uncomfortably on their feet. Trapped in a social nightmare, I stood there in the doorway to the living room, bathed in the bright, unforgiving, almost interrogative light of their ridiculously oversized modern chandelier. I felt like an actress who had just walked onto the wrong stage, into the wrong play, wearing the wrong costume, bearing the wrong convenient truth. But I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I did not offer a nervous, apologetic smile. I simply stood there, my posture erect despite the ache in my hip, meeting their shocked, curious, pitying, and perhaps even vaguely accusatory stares with a quiet, unwavering dignity I didn't even know I possessed until that moment. Let them look, I thought, a cold, clear resolve solidifying within me. Let them see. Let them bear witness. Let them confront the ugly and convenient truth that had just crashed their perfect, curated, oh-so-important party. The bruise wasn't just my injury, it was their indictment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, becoming a physical entity in the room, pressing down on everyone. I could feel the weight of their unspoken questions, their frantic mental calculations, their desperate desire for someone, anyone, to break the unbearable tension. And in that profound, echoing silence, I waited. My eyes found Crystal across the room. She stood frozen, her perfect hostess smile plastered on her face like a grotesque mask, her eyes wide with a mixture of sheer panic and icy fury. I waited for her, waiting for the next line in this terrible, unforeseen and deeply revealing family drama, waiting for my daughter to speak, waiting to see which mask she would choose to wear now. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, thick with unspoken questions, horrified speculation, and the palpable discomfort of 30 pairs of eyes darting between my bruised face and my daughter's frozen smile. The guests looked deeply uncomfortable, trapped like unwilling extras in a particularly ugly reality television show. Marcus stood near the fireplace, no longer smirking but watching me with a wary, defensive tension, a muscle twitching ominously in his jaw. He was likely calculating the potential damage to his own reputation. And Crystal, my daughter, she stood near the center of the room, the unwilling focal point of the disaster, her face pale beneath her expensive foundation, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic panic that bordered on hysteria. I could almost see the frantic calculations spinning in her mind like a runaway hamster wheel. Her perfect party, her carefully curated image, her performance of effortless upper-middle-class success and domestic bliss, all of it was imploding, threatened by this ugly, inconvenient, undeniable intrusion of reality. My bruised face wasn't just an injury, it was a social bomb that had just detonated spectacularly in the middle of her meticulously arranged living room, and she was scrambling, desperately, for damage control, for a narrative that could somehow contain the blast. Her first instinct, clearly, was denial by distraction. She tried to restart a sputtering conversation with the bewildered-looking couple nearest her, her laugh a little too high, a little too brittle, painfully forced. So, as I was saying about the amazing new chef at the Gilded Spoon, but no one was listening. All eyes inevitably kept flicking back towards me. Towards the unavoidable silent accusation etched onto my face. Her second instinct, equally ineffective, was anger, though she kept it tightly controlled behind her rigid smile. I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated fury in her eyes as she darted a venomous glance towards me. Fury that I had dared to emerge from my room. Fury that I had dared to spoil her carefully staged party with my inconvenient presence. Fury that I was forcing her and her guests to confront the ugliness she had tried so desperately, so conveniently to sweep under the rug or perhaps behind the garage door of her conscience. But her third instinct, the one that ultimately won out, the one that revealed the true chilling, almost sociopathic depth of her character's decay, was ruthless self-preservation through aggressive narrative control. She couldn't ignore the bruise any longer. It was too obvious, too central to the room's horrified attention. She couldn't erase it, so she would reframe it. She would absorb the shock, the horror into her own twisted narrative, spin it into something that horrifyingly, perversely validated her husband's aggression and diminished me, the victim, even further. She took a deep, visible breath, the kind an actress takes before delivering a particularly challenging line. She plastered a bright, brittle, almost manic smile onto her face, a smile that didn't reach her terrified eyes. And she addressed the silent, watching room, her captive audience. Her voice when she spoke was deliberately loud, clear, a tempting confidence ringing with a horrifying, misplaced, almost grotesque pride that made my blood run cold and my stomach churn. "Oh, that," she said, gesturing vaguely, dismissively towards my battered face with a casual, almost flippant wave of her perfectly manicured hand, as if commenting on a minor, easily fixable decorating flaw like a scuff on the wall. The collective gaze of the room, which had been fixed on me, shifted momentarily, reluctantly towards her, then immediately back to me, hungry for the explanation, the context, the story behind this shocking silent tableau. Crystal stepped forward then, moving deliberately towards the center of the room, positioning herself slightly in front of Marcus, taking center stage, reclaiming the spotlight even in the midst of this disaster. Her smile widened, becoming almost predatory, challenging. "Don't you all worry your pretty little heads about Mom, Brenda," she chirped, her tone sickeningly cheerful, dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost suffocating. "She just had a little disagreement earlier. Got a bit worked up, you know how elders can be sometimes." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the insidious implication hang heavy and poisonous in the air. The implication that I, the elderly, emotional, perhaps slightly senile woman, was prone to irrational outbursts, that I was the source of the conflict, the one responsible for the tension. Then she delivered the line that would echo in the horrified silence of the room long after the sound waves dissipated, the line that would sever the last tattered bleeding remnants of my maternal love for her, the line that irrevocably sealed her own fate. "It was my husband," she announced, her voice ringing with a grotesque, almost celebratory pride that defied all reason, all decency. She turned and beamed, positively beamed at Marcus, placing a possessive, almost worshipful hand on his arm, aligning herself completely publicly with him. He taught her some respect. The words landed in the stunned, disbelieving silence like stones dropped into a deep, dark well, the ripples spreading outwards, chilling everyone they touched. Taught her some respect. She wasn't just excusing his violence, minimizing his aggression, she was actively endorsing it. She was framing his act of physical force, whether accidental in its final execution or intentional in its initial lunge. The result, the injury, was the same, as a necessary, justified, even positive act of discipline. A lesson administered. She was publicly aligning herself totally with his abuse, presenting it as a laudable corrective measure taken against her own mother, the woman who had raised her. The shock in the room was palpable, visceral, jaws dropped literally, eyes widened in utter disbelief. I saw several guests physically recoil, taking an involuntary step backwards. I saw several women exchange horrified, sickened glances. Even in the superficial, morally flexible crowd, accustomed perhaps to overlooking minor transgressions in the pursuit of status, Crystal's statement had clearly crossed a fundamental, unforgivable line, violated a basic taboo of human decency. But Crystal, blinded by her desperate, pathological need to protect her husband, to control the narrative at all costs, to maintain her fragile sense of power even in the face of this catastrophe, seemed utterly oblivious to the wave of revulsion she had just inspired. She simply stood there, beaming proudly, possessively at Marcus, convinced, apparently, that she had successfully managed the crisis, spun the ugly, inconvenient truth into a story that somehow reflected positively on them, on his strength, his authority, his masculine right to enforce respect upon a woman, even his own mother-in-law. She had no idea she had just committed social and possibly moral suicide in front of 30 witnesses. She had just handed her uncle, who was even now stepping silently through the front door, all the ammunition he would ever need. As Crystal's horrifying words, "He taught her some respect," hung heavy and poisonous in the stunned, suffocating silence of the living room. A silence now thick not just with shock but with palpable disgust. All eyes inevitably shifted from her beaming, oblivious, almost manic face to his. To Marcus, the man who had, according to his own wife's proud public declaration, administered this brutal lesson in respect, leaving its stark, ugly, undeniable evidence visibly blooming on my face. And Marcus? He didn't flinch under the weight of 30 pairs of suddenly judgmental eyes. He didn't look ashamed, not even for a microsecond. He didn't look angry or defensive, ready to justify his actions further. He didn't even have the minimal decency to look uncomfortable, caught out in an act of aggression, however he might try to spin it. Instead, as the silence stretched and the collective gaze of the room settled upon him, he smirked. It wasn't a broad, triumphant grin. That would have been too obvious, perhaps even acknowledging the severity of the situation. No. This was something smaller, tighter, more insidious, a small, tight, barely perceptible upward curl of one corner of his lip, accompanied by a slight, almost reptilian narrowing of his eyes. It was unmistakable. It was a smirk of pure, unadulterated, arrogant satisfaction. It was the quiet, confident smirk of a bully who has just successfully landed a painful, humiliating punch on a weaker opponent and feels absolutely unquestionably validated in his dominance. It was the smirk of a man who believes deep in his hollow core that he has not only gotten away with something morally reprehensible, but has actually won. In that single, fleeting yet utterly revealing facial expression, I saw the entirety of his character laid bare, exposed more clearly than any investigation or psychological profile could ever reveal. I saw the deep-seated insecurity that constantly fueled his aggressive need for control and validation. I saw the staggering entitlement that allowed him to believe his desires, his comfort, his definition of respect, superseded everyone else's rights, including my fundamental right to basic physical safety and dignity within my home. I saw the inherent cowardice that manifested as casual cruelty towards someone he perceived as weaker, older, less important, less valuable in his transactional worldview. I saw the profound, almost pathological lack of empathy, the chilling inability to recognize, let alone regret, the physical and emotional pain he had inflicted. He truly, genuinely believed he was in the right. He believed he had successfully and perhaps even necessarily asserted his authority in his own home, finally put the troublesome, quietly defiant mother-in-law firmly in her place. He saw my bruise not as shameful evidence of his own loss of control, his own inherent violence, but as a badge of his power, a visible symbol of his dominance within the family hierarchy. And his wife's shocking public endorsement of his actions. That wasn't a horrifying misstep in his eyes. It was simply confirmation of his rightful status. His queen had publicly validated his rule. His dominance was absolute, unquestioned. He had won. He stood there beside Crystal, basking in the thick, horrified silence of the room, completely misinterpreting the guest's fear and revulsion as a form of grudging respect for his authority. He subtly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive shirt, squared his shoulders almost imperceptibly, lifted his chin just a fraction, projecting an aura of untouchable masculine power. He was the undisputed king of his castle, the master of his domain, and he had just successfully, efficiently, quelled a minor insignificant peasant uprising. That smirk, vile, triumphant, contemptuous, utterly, fatally oblivious to the storm that was gathering just outside his castle walls. The storm that was, even at that very moment, stepping across his threshold. A storm in the form of my fiercely protective, quietly formidable and unexpectedly present younger brother. A storm that was about to wash his pathetic, self-constructed little kingdom and his arrogant smirk away entirely, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. It was, I knew with a chilling, almost clairvoyant certainty born of pure, focused rage, the last moment of uncomplicated, arrogant satisfaction he would likely experience for a very, very long time. The universe, in its own mysterious, often brutal way, has a penchant for dramatic timing and ironic justice, and the cavalry, silenzioso mortale, was about to arrive. Just as the horrified silence in the room began to fracture, dissolving into low, shocked whispers and the awkward shuffling sounds of guests desperately trying to look anywhere but at me or at Marcus, just as Marcus's self-satisfied smirk was perhaps beginning to fade into a slightly more guarded, uncertain expression under the sheer suffocating weight of the collective disapproval, the doorbell chimed again. The sound, usually a cheerful, welcoming announcement, now felt jarring, intrusive, almost ominous, like an alarm bell signaling a further, perhaps even more catastrophic breach of the already shattered social contract of the evening. Crystal, jolted violently out of her oblivious post-declaration haze by the sudden noise, looked towards the front door with raw, undisguised annoyance. Her carefully managed, albeit disastrous performance was being interrupted yet again. "Who on earth could that be?" she muttered, her voice tight with frayed nerves and escalating frustration. "We're not expecting anyone else. Honestly, can't people read an RSVP?" She glanced around helplessly, looking for anyone to handle this new intrusion. Her eyes landed on Kevin, my son, who was standing near the foyer looking pale, useless, and utterly shell-shocked by the preceding drama. "Kevin," she snapped, her voice sharp, discarding even the pretense of affection. "Get the damn door, will you? It's probably just a late catering delivery or something." Kevin, seemingly grateful for any excuse to escape the suffocating tension of the living room, practically bolted towards the front hall like a man fleeing a burning building. I heard the heavy, oversized front door creak open, followed by a low, indistinct murmur of voices, Kevin's uncertain, questioning tone, hesitant and unsure, and another voice, a deeper, calmer, more resonant voice that held an easy, natural authority, a voice I hadn't heard in person in nearly a year, but which sent a sudden, unexpected jolt of warmth and hope through my bruised and battered spirit. A moment later, Kevin reappeared in the wide archway connecting the foyer to the living room. His face, if possible, was even paler than before. He looked utterly bewildered, almost frightened, like someone who had just seen a ghost or perhaps encountered a force far beyond his comprehension. "Crystal," he stammered, his eyes wide and slightly unfocused. It's your Uncle Charles." A new wave of confusion rippled through the already unsettled room. Uncle Charles? Crystal didn't have an Uncle Charles. The Devereaux, Moore family tree was well documented, a source of immense pride for them and utterly devoid of any Charleses on the main branches. My brother, the one she barely acknowledged, the one she subtly discouraged me from even mentioning, he was Charles. And then he stepped into the light, moving past Kevin into the foyer, his presence immediately commanding the space. My younger brother, Charles Johnson, but not the lanky, intense, bookish boy I remembered helping raise after our own father passed. This was Charles the man, the force of nature, 55 years old, tall, lean, radiating a quiet, almost intimidating energy. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that whispered serious, understated money, the kind that doesn't need to shout. His salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp, his face calm, intelligent, but lined with the evidence of hard-fought battles in boardrooms and courtrooms. He held a beautifully wrapped, obviously expensive gift, likely a rare first edition for my library, in one hand. He had flown in from Chicago as a complete surprise for my 60th birthday. It was just like him, hating fuss, avoiding attention, but always showing up solidly, dependably when it mattered. We hadn't seen each other in person since George's funeral nearly 2 years ago, our busy lives and the geographical distance keeping us physically separated, but our bond, forged in a childhood marked by shared struggle after our parents died young, cemented by my sacrifices to ensure he got the education I couldn't, and nurtured by decades of unwavering mutual support and fierce loyalty, remained the one truly unbreakable anchor in my life. He was my rock, my confidant, my fiercest protector, the one person in the world, now that George was gone, who truly saw me, understood me, valued me without reservation or judgment. He stepped fully into the foyer, his sharp eyes scanning the opulent, unfamiliar surroundings with a flicker of analytical curiosity, perhaps taking in the sheer, almost vulgar expense of the house. His face broke into that warm, familiar, slightly crooked smile as he searched the now utterly silent, crowded living room, looking for me. "Vivian?" he called out, his voice rich and resonant, cutting easily through the lingering, awkward tension, full of affection and anticipation. "Happy birthday, sis. Surprise, where are you hiding?" He started walking towards the living room, towards the area where I stood awkwardly near the doorway, his smile widening as he navigated through the clusters of stunned, silent guests who parted before him like the Red Sea. He hadn't yet registered the underlying tension in the room. He hadn't yet seen my face clearly in the relatively dim light of the foyer. He was just my little brother, happy, excited, arriving completely unaware, bearing gifts, ready to celebrate his beloved older sister's milestone birthday. He was walking into an ambush, utterly unprepared for the ugly reality he was about to confront. And his arrival, his unexpected powerful presence, was about to change the entire equation, igniting a firestorm that would consume everything in its path. Charles moved further into the living room, his warm, anticipatory smile still in place, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for me. "Vivian, there you are, happy birthday." He stopped, dead in his tracks. Just a few feet away from me now, fully illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving light of the oversized chandelier. His smile didn't just fade, it vanished instantly, extinguished as if by a sudden icy wind. His eyes, sharp and lawyerly perceptive, narrowed, focusing immediately with laser-like intensity, not on my face as a whole but on the grotesque, swollen, multicolored bruise that dominated the left side, stark and ugly against my skin. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous, terrifying. The cheerful surprise guest evaporated. In his place stood Charles Johnson, the feared corporate litigator, the man known in Chicago legal circles for his icy calm, his razor-sharp intellect, and his utter ruthlessness in pursuing justice for his clients. He was assessing the evidence, processing the implications, and the barely suppressed fury that began to emanate from him was a palpable force, chilling the already tense air of the room even further. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked. His gaze flickered from my bruised eye down to my simple dress, then swept across the opulent room, taking in the expensive decor, the lavish spread of food and drink, the well-dressed, uncomfortable guests. His eyes landed briefly on Crystal, standing frozen near the fireplace, her face pale with dawning terror, then shifted to Marcus, whose own expression was now a mixture of confusion and a rapidly growing, unwelcome apprehension. He still didn't know who Charles was, beyond Vivian's brother, but he could clearly sense the dangerous shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, unwelcome intrusion of real, unquantifiable power into his carefully controlled domain. Charles's gaze finally returned to me. He took the remaining few steps, closing the distance between us, creating a small, intense pocket of silence in the midst of the crowded room. He reached out, his hand surprisingly gentle, his fingers cool and steady, and tilted my chin up slightly, examining the bruise with a clinical, dispassionate eye, assessing the extent of the damage. His touch was professional, almost detached, but beneath it I felt the familiar, fiercely protective warmth of my little brother, the boy who had once fought off bullies twice his size for me in the schoolyard. "Vivian?" His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low, terrifyingly calm, but vibrating with a tightly controlled, white-hot fury that was almost palpable. A contained nuclear reaction. "What in God's holy name happened to your eye?" I opened my mouth to speak, the pre-programmed instinct to minimize, to deflect, to smooth things over, rising automatically. "Oh, it's nothing, Charles. I just tripped." The lie formed on my lips, a pathetic shield against the storm I knew was coming. But before I could utter a single dishonest syllable, before I could even formulate the flimsy excuse, Charles seemed to sense my hesitation, my ingrained, lifelong habit of absorbing pain, of protecting others even at my own expense. His eyes flickered past me again, catching the terrified, guilty expression on Crystal's face, the defensive, cornered look on Marcus's. He looked back at my face, at the bruise, at the unshed tears shimmering in my eyes. And in that instant, with the speed and clarity of a brilliant legal mind connecting disparate pieces of evidence, I saw the entire, ugly story click into place behind his sharp, analytical eyes. He read it all, the disrespect, the tension, the likely cause of the injury, Crystal's horrifying explanation he must have overheard upon entering. He didn't need my confirmation, he knew. His hand dropped abruptly from my chin. The brief moment of gentle, fraternal concern vanished completely, replaced by the cold, lethal focus of a prosecutor moving in for the final, devastating kill. He turned slowly, deliberately away from me, presenting his back to me as if shielding me from what was about to happen. His gaze swept across the suddenly terrified faces of my daughter and her smirking husband. The shift in the room's energy was seismic, absolute. The air crackled with a new, dangerous, almost electric tension. The superficial social drama of the birthday party had just irrevocably escalated into something far more serious, Far more primal, far more consequential. Charles Johnson, the unexpected guest, the unknown variable, the quiet powerhouse, had just taken complete, absolute control of the room, and judgment, swift, merciless, and utterly unavoidable, was about to be rendered upon those who had wronged his sister. The temperature in the room plummeted. Charles moved towards Crystal and Marcus with a quiet, deliberate pace that felt infinitely more menacing than any angry stride could have. He walked like a panther closing in on cornered prey, each step measured, purposeful, radiating a cold, coiled energy. The guests, sensing the imminent confrontation, instinctively shuffled further back, creating a wider, clearer space around the trio, an impromptu courtroom arena in the middle of Crystal's ridiculously expensive living room. They were no longer just uncomfortable observers, they were witnesses, trapped in a drama far more real and far more terrifying than they had anticipated. Crystal flinched visibly as Charles stopped directly in front of her, his tall frame seeming to loom over her, though he made no physically threatening move. Her earlier horrifying pride, her attempt at defiant spin control had completely crumbled, leaving behind only raw, naked, undisguised fear. She looked like a child caught red-handed in a terrible act, anticipating a punishment she knew she couldn't escape. Marcus, beside her, attempted to maintain a semblance of composure, puffing up his chest slightly in a reflexive, defensive posture, but the fear was evident in his eyes too, flickering behind the rapidly fading facade of arrogance. He still didn't know the full extent of Charles's power, but he clearly recognized the dangerous, unwavering resolve in the older man's gaze. Charles focused first on his niece, his eyes cold and hard as chips of obsidian, boring into hers, pinning her like an insect under a microscope. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft, almost conversational, yet it possessed a chilling clarity that cut through the utter silence of the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Crystal," he began, the simple use of her name sounding less like an address and more like the first count in a formal indictment. "As I was walking through the foyer just now, delayed momentarily by Kevin's somewhat welcome, I believe I overheard you offering an explanation for your mother's rather shocking facial injury." Crystal swallowed hard, the sound audible in the stillness. Her eyes darted nervously towards Marcus, seeking support, guidance, an escape route, then back to Charles's implacable face. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny it, perhaps to backtrack, perhaps to desperately try and spin yet another more palatable story. But Charles, anticipating her move, didn't give her the chance. He held up a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that nonetheless commanded absolute silence. "Correct me if I'm wrong," he continued, his voice still terrifyingly calm, meticulously laying out the damning evidence. "But did I just hear you announce, quite clearly, to this entire room full of your friends and colleagues, that your husband, this man," he gestured briefly towards Marcus with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, "hit your mother, inflicted that injury?" He paused, letting the ugly, undeniable accusation hang heavy and poisonous in the air. "And that he did so, in your considered opinion, to teach her some respect?" He let the horrifying words reverberate in the silence, forcing everyone in that room to confront the full, unvarnished, grotesque horror of what she had said, what she had endorsed, what she had revealed about her own character. Crystal could only manage a small, pathetic, almost involuntary shake of her head, tears finally welling in her eyes, and beginning to stream down her pale cheeks. Tears not of remorse, I suspected even then, but of pure self-pitying terror at being caught, at being exposed. Charles didn't require her verbal confirmation. The evidence was clear, the admission public. He turned his gaze then, slow and deliberate, like a heavy gun turret swiveling towards its target, onto Marcus. The contempt in his expression intensified, deepening into something that bordered on pure, unadulterated loathing. Marcus, visibly recoiled under the weight of that gaze, puffing up his chest again in a last, desperate, reflexive display of threatened masculinity. "And you?" Charles said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost a menacing hiss, sharp and dangerous. "The man who supposedly administered this cowardly lesson, the man who strikes a woman, an elderly woman, his own mother-in-law in her own daughter's home." He let the damning facts pile up, each one a blow. "You find this situation amusing. You stand here, beside the woman you allegedly assaulted, bearing the visible proof of your aggression, and you smirk?" Marcus, fueled perhaps by a final desperate surge of cornered adrenaline, by his own deeply ingrained arrogance, and by the sheer terrifying humiliation of being dressed down so thoroughly in front of his peers, decided to bluster, to make one last fatal attempt to assert his dominance. "Now, Hold on just a minute, old man, he began, trying to inject a note of dismissive authority into his trembling voice, taking a half step forward. You don't know the whole story, you don't know what happened. This is a private family matter. It's none of your damn business. Charles cut him off mid-sentence, not by raising his voice, not by making a physical move, but simply by taking a single, almost imperceptible step closer himself, silently, lithely, invading Marcus's personal space, his presence suddenly overwhelming, suffocating. The effect was immediate, devastating. Marcus involuntarily took a stumbling step back, his fragile bluster deflating instantly like a punctured balloon. Assaulting my sister, Charles stated, his voice now like silk sliding effortlessly over sharpened, deadly steel, each word precise, measured, final. Makes it precisely my business, Mr. Moore. And believe me, he added, a chilling, predatory light entering his eyes, you have absolutely no idea, none whatsoever, how much business I intend to make it before this night is over. The threat was no longer veiled or subtle. It was direct, personal, absolute, and carried the unmistakable, terrifying weight of someone who possessed not just the unwavering will, but also the vast, unseen means to follow through completely. The superficial birthday party had just irrevocably become Marcus Moore's personal day of reckoning, and the judge, jury, and unexpected, implacable executioner had just arrived, uninvited, unwelcome, and utterly determined to see justice served. Cold. Marcus, despite the clear and present danger radiating from Charles like heat from a furnace, despite the collective horrified gaze of the entire room now fixed upon him, couldn't quite let go of his ingrained sense of dominance, his reflexive need to assert himself, even in the face of imminent destruction. His identity was so intertwined with the performance of power, that admitting defeat, even strategically, seemed impossible for him. He made one last, desperate, and ultimately fatal attempt to regain control of the narrative, puffing up his chest again like a threatened, cornered rooster preparing for a fight. It couldn't possibly win. Look, I don't know who you think you are, buddy, Marcus sneered, trying to project a confidence he clearly no longer felt, his voice raspy, his eyes darting nervously towards his suddenly silent colleagues and friends among the guests. Perhaps seeking backup that wasn't coming, but you can't just walk in here into my house. The irony was almost physically painful, and start making wild accusations and vague threats based on some misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Charles interrupted smoothly, his voice dangerously calm, almost conversational, the tone of a lawyer patiently dissecting a particularly flimsy, poorly constructed argument on the witness stand. There seems to be no misunderstanding about the bruise on my sister's face, Marcus, nor about your wife's rather enthusiastic explanation for it. He paused, letting the shame of that statement land again. But you are correct about one thing. Perhaps I haven't been entirely clear about who I think I am. Allow me to rectify that. He shifted his stance slightly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet the movement seemed to draw all the energy in the room towards him. My name is Charles Johnson, he stated simply, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. And while my sister Vivian chose a life of noble public service, I pursued a slightly different path. In Chicago. In corporate law initially, then more recently in venture capital and private equity. He let those words, venture capital and private equity, settle in the air for a moment. They were magic words in Marcus and Crystal's world, talismans of real power, real wealth. I saw a flicker of confused recognition, then dawning sickening comprehension in Marcus's eyes. He was starting to connect dots. He desperately didn't want to connect. You see, Marcus, Charles continued, his tone still deceptively mild, almost professorial, while you've been busy playing the big-shot regional sales manager down here, making noise about your commissions and your leased luxury cars, I've been spending the last 2 decades quietly observing various markets, identifying potential growth opportunities, and occasionally, investing. Discreetly. He let that word, investing, hang in the air again. Heavier this time, pregnant with implication. Marcus frowned, his face paling further, suspicion rapidly solidifying into a terrible certainty. Investing, he whispered, the word barely audible. Investing in what? What are you talking about? Charles allowed himself that small, cold smile again, the smile of a predator revealing its teeth just before the final strike. It was chilling. I'm talking about your company, Marcus. More Marketing Solutions, isn't it? Your struggling little sales consulting firm, as I believe my quarterly financial reports categorize its performance. The one you launched with such high hopes and such, shall we say, inadequate initial funding, About 5 years ago. The blood drained completely from Marcus's face now. He looked physically ill. He knew with absolute gut-wrenching certainty where this was going. He had walked directly into a perfectly laid financial ambush. You might recall, Charles continued relentlessly, his tone still deceptively light, enjoying the kill, receiving a rather substantial and remarkably timely infusion of seed capital back then. Just when things were looking particularly bleak, it came, if I remember correctly, from a blind trust, structured through an anonymous offshore holding company based in the Cayman Islands. Very discreet, very professional. He paused. An investment structured, rather cleverly if I do say so myself, as a convertible note, giving the anonymous investor significant leverage, ongoing access to your company's financials, and most importantly, the unilateral option to convert the outstanding debt to controlling equity, specifically, majority ownership, under certain conditions. Marcus was visibly trembling now, his face a sickly pasty gray. He looked like he might actually collapse right there on Crystal's expensive Persian rug. Crystal herself stared at her husband, then back at Charles, her expression one of utter uncomprehending horror. The financial ground beneath their feet was not just shaking, it was liquefying. That anonymous investor, Marcus, Charles concluded, his voice dropping the last vestiges of pleasantry, becoming hard as granite, cold as a judge's sentence, was me. A little gesture I made, a calculated risk taken, I might add, primarily at my sister Vivian's quiet, heartfelt request back then, to help her daughter's ambitious new husband get his start, build something of his own. He let that devastating detail land with surgical precision, the fact that the very woman Marcus had just assaulted, the woman he held in such contempt, was indirectly, fundamentally, responsible for his company's very existence, his entire fragile career. Now, Charles continued, his eyes now boring relentlessly into Marcus's terrified ones. I seem to recall the rather detailed terms of that convertible note included several stringent covenants regarding the borrower's ongoing conduct, specifically clauses related to maintaining ethical business practices and avoiding any actions that could pose a significant reputational risk to the investment. Assaulting a family member, particularly the elderly sister of the primary investor, resulting in visible physical injury, I believe my legal team would strongly argue that constitutes a rather significant, wouldn't you say, material breach of covenant. He didn't wait for an answer. Marcus was clearly incapable of giving. A breach, Charles stated flatly, that gives me, the note holder, the immediate unilateral right to call in the entire outstanding note, principal plus 5 years of aggressively accrued interest, payable within 24 hours. He paused, letting the impossibility of that demand sink in. Or perhaps more interestingly, given the circumstances, to exercise the equity conversion clause, which I am hereby doing, effective immediately. He glanced at his watch. Consider this verbal notification legally binding. My lawyers will follow up with the formal paperwork by courier in the morning. He had just dropped a nuclear bomb, quietly, calmly, devastatingly in the middle of their living room. He hadn't just revealed a hidden, inconvenient family connection. He had revealed that he owned Marcus, locks, stock and barrel. His company, his future, his entire professional existence. The arrogant, abusive son-in-law wasn't just facing social disgrace and potential criminal charges, he was facing complete and utter financial annihilation, orchestrated with chilling precision by the fiercely protective brother of the woman he had just assaulted. The smirk was well and truly gone now, replaced by the slack-jawed, vacant terror of a man whose entire world, everything he had built, everything he valued, had just evaporated into thin air before his very eyes. Checkmate. The revelation, the quiet, devastating announcement that Charles Johnson wasn't just my brother but Marcus's silent, controlling investor, hung in the air like radioactive fallout. Thick and suffocating, Marcus looked utterly broken, his face ashen, his body trembling visibly as the full implications of his financial ruin washed over him. Crystal stared at her husband, then back at Charles, her expression a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. The man she had married, the source of her coveted status, her financial security, was not a self-made success story at all. He was a puppet, a heavily leveraged pawn, whose strings were held entirely by her own previously dismissed, now terrifyingly powerful, uncle. The foundation of her entire glittering world wasn't just cracked, it was revealed to have been a complete illusion, built on borrowed money and hidden dependencies. Charles, however, having delivered the financial death blow, was not finished. His justice was methodical, comprehensive, leaving no loose ends, no room for escape. He turned his cold, lawyerly gaze back to the shell-shocked Marcus, who seemed frozen in a state of catatonic shock. "So Marcus," Charles continued, his voice quiet but utterly ruthless, each word a precisely aimed hammer blow, driving another nail securely into the coffin of Marcus's life as he knew it. "We have clearly established my rather significant standing as your primary, and now deeply concerned, perhaps even aggrieved investor. Let's move on to discuss the immediate tangible consequences of your regrettable lesson in respect." He paused deliberately, letting the fear deepen, letting Marcus contemplate the abyss that had just opened beneath his feet. "Effective immediately," Charles stated flatly. "Consider all your existing corporate funding lines frozen. My holding company guarantees most of your operational credit, a fact you seemed conveniently unaware of. Those guarantees are hereby revoked." Another pillar of Marcus's fragile business crumbled. "As previously stated," he went on, relentless, "I am exercising my right as per our legally binding agreement to call in the full convertible note. You have, let's be generous and say precisely 24 hours from this moment to repay the principal plus 5 years of aggressively compounded interest. The exact figure, likely well into the 7 figures, will be detailed in the documents my lawyers deliver tomorrow." He glanced around the ridiculously oversized room. "Failure to remit the full amount by close of business tomorrow, which seems, shall we say, highly probable given your company's precarious cash flow situation, I've been monitoring, will automatically irrevocably trigger the equity conversion clause. More marketing solutions, or what remains of it after I liquidate the non-performing assets, will become a wholly owned subsidiary of my primary holding company by Monday morning. Your services, naturally, given your demonstrated lack of judgment and questionable character, will no longer be required. Consider yourself terminated, effective immediately upon conversion." He had just vaporized Marcus's company, his livelihood, his entire professional identity, in less than 60 seconds, using the very contract Marcus had likely signed without fully reading or understanding years ago. Furthermore, Charles continued, shifting his focus slightly, moving from financial execution to professional assassination. "The matter of assaulting an elderly woman, particularly one with a visible physical injury clearly resulting from that assault, constitutes at minimum aggravated assault and battery in this state. Charges which I am more than prepared to pursue vigorously, both criminally through the district attorney's office. I believe I know the DA quite well, actually, and civilly, seeking substantial punitive damages." He paused, letting the threat of legal action, of police reports, of public trials hang heavy in the air. "However," he added, a flicker of something almost like strategic mercy, or perhaps just a preference for cleaner, quieter kills, entering his voice, "perhaps we can avoid the unpleasantness of involving the authorities. I wonder how your regional vice president, Bob Henderson, isn't it? Good man, terrible golfer, happens to be a long-time golfing buddy of mine from our university days, would feel about learning that his star regional manager has a penchant for physically disciplining his mother-in-law. Very bad for the corporate image, wouldn't you say, especially for a company that prides itself on its family values marketing campaigns." He let the implications sink in. He wasn't just threatening Marcus's current job, he was threatening his entire career, his future employability in any reputable sales organization. He was systematically dismantling not just Marcus's present but his future, salting the very earth of his professional prospects. Finally, Charles turned his attention briefly, almost dismissively, to the house itself, the opulent stage for this domestic tragedy. "And this lovely home," he said, his gaze sweeping with faint distaste over the expensive, impersonal decor that screamed new money, impressive square footage, financed, I believe, through a rather complex high-interest mortgage arrangement with a private lender after the banks turned you down. He looked back at Marcus, whose face was now completely devoid of expression, a mask of pure shock. "That lender, serendipitously enough, also happens to be one of my subsidiary holding companies. Small world, isn't it?" He didn't need to elaborate further. The unspoken threat was clear. The house, the very symbol of their superficial success, the reason for their cruelty towards me, was also ultimately under his control. Foreclosure, should Marcus somehow manage to survive the initial financial onslaught, was now a distinct, imminent possibility. He had systematically, calmly, devastatingly, in the space of less than 5 minutes, stripped Marcus bare, his company, his career prospects, his home, his reputation, his carefully constructed facade of success. All gone, all forfeit, all due to a single arrogant act of violence born of insecurity, and a lifetime of disrespect culminating in one final catastrophic misjudgment about the quiet old woman in the corner. The silence in the room was absolute now, broken only by the sound of Crystal beginning to sob again, not the earlier tears of panic, but low, racking, hopeless sobs of utter, complete despair. Marcus just stood there, swaying slightly on his feet, looking utterly, completely, and irrevocably ruined. The smirk was a distant, almost unimaginable memory. The arrogance was gone, vaporized. All that remained was the hollow, trembling shell of a man staring blankly into the abyss that had just opened up before him, an abyss entirely of his own making. The fallout from Charles's quiet, devastating pronouncements was immediate, visceral, and utterly catastrophic. The carefully constructed facade of Crystal and Marcus's perfect, successful life didn't just crack under the pressure, it imploded spectacularly, collapsing inward like a dying star under the weight of its own empty mass. Marcus, faced with the sudden, irretrievable, and public loss of literally everything he valued, his company, his identity, his status, his oxygen, his house, his trophy, his future, his only remaining hope, seemed to physically shrink before our eyes. The arrogant swagger, the performative confidence, evaporated completely, leaving behind a trembling, pale-faced man gasping for air in the ruins of his own making. He opened his mouth, perhaps to plead for mercy he didn't deserve, perhaps to argue against the inevitable, perhaps to simply scream into the void, but no sound came out. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting frantically from Charles's implacable, stony face to the horrified, rapidly distancing expressions of his colleagues and supposed friends among the guests, who were now actively edging towards the door, desperate to escape the blast radius of his disgrace, to his weeping, collapsing wife, and finally, briefly, agonizingly, back to me, the quiet catalyst for his destruction. In that fleeting, hunted glance, I saw not anger, not hatred, but pure unadulterated terror, and perhaps, just perhaps, the first, faint, sickening, glimmer of self-awareness. He finally, truly understood. He had picked a fight with the wrong family. He had underestimated the quiet old woman in the corner, mistaking dignity for weakness, and in doing so had triggered an avalanche of consequences that had buried him completely, irrevocably. Crystal dissolved into full-blown hysterics, collapsing onto the expensive white carpet in a heap of sequined despair. Her carefully constructed composure, the mask of the perfect hostess, the successful wife, shattered completely, revealing the raw, terrified, deeply insecure woman beneath. Her sobs were no longer quiet or controlled. They were loud, racking, ugly gasps for breath that tore through the stunned silence of the room. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her luxurious lifestyle, the impending financial ruin. She was mourning the catastrophic loss of her identity, the carefully crafted illusion she had desperately mistaken for reality. She clawed blindly at Marcus's leg as he stood frozen beside her, not seeking comfort or support, but perhaps out of sheer animalistic panic, like a drowning swimmer pulling down anyone within reach. "Do something, Marcus," she shrieked, her voice shrill, unrecognizable, stripped bare of all its cultivated sophistication. "Fix this. You have to fix this. Tell him it's a mistake. Tell him you're sorry." But Marcus was broken, beyond repair, beyond fixing anything. He shook his head numbly, pulling his leg away from her grasp with a look of dazed detachment. "It's over, Crystal," he whispered, his voice hoarse, defeated, barely audible. "Don't you understand? He owns everything. It's all gone. We're ruined." The finality in his tone seemed to penetrate even her hysteria, silencing her momentarily, leaving her staring up at him with wide, uncomprehending, tear-filled eyes. The party guests, who had been frozen in a state of horrified fascination, now began to move decisively, suddenly desperate to escape the blast radius of this catastrophic social and financial detonation before they too were tainted by association. Conversations started again, but now they were low, urgent whispers, punctuated by nervous glances towards the ruined couple and towards Charles, who stood like a calm, immovable object amidst the swirling chaos. People avoided eye contact with Crystal and Marcus entirely, edging discreetly towards the foyer, murmuring plausible excuses about early mornings, babysitters suddenly falling ill, forgotten appointments, their carefully cultivated network, their audience, their precious social capital. It was all evaporating before their very eyes, dissolving like mist in the harsh light of public disgrace. They were becoming pariahs in their own home, at their own disastrous party. The performance was well and truly over. Charles, his grim work of delivering the consequences now complete, ignored the chaos swirling around him with the disdainful air of a man accustomed to navigating far more significant corporate meltdowns. The shouting, the crying, the frantic whispers of the departing guests. It was all just noise now, the predictable messy aftermath of a necessary, if unpleasant, demolition. His focus returned entirely, completely to me, his expression softening instantly from icy righteous fury back to gentle unwavering fraternal concern. He walked back over to me deliberately, pointedly turning his back on the wreckage of Marcus and Crystal's lives, creating a small protective cordon around me. He gently took my arm again, his touch warm, solid, reassuring amidst the swirling disintegration. "Vivian," he said softly, his voice full of a quiet, unwavering strength that felt like an anchor in a storm. "Come on, let's get you out of here. You're coming home with me right now." Home with him? Back to his quiet, elegant apartment in Chicago? Or perhaps just away from here, away from this toxic, soul-destroying environment? It didn't truly matter where. The words themselves were a balm, a promise of safety, of sanctuary, of unconditional support, of finally being seen, valued, protected. I looked across the rapidly emptying room, past Charles's protective shoulder at my weeping, shattered daughter, kneeling on the floor, her beautiful dress stained with tears and perhaps spilled wine. I looked at my son-in-law standing hollow-eyed and broken amidst the glittering ruins of his own making. I felt a flicker of something, pity, perhaps. A residual, deeply ingrained, almost involuntary maternal ache for Crystal's pain. However self-inflicted, but it was quickly decisively overshadowed by a profound, almost overwhelming sense of release, of finality, of justice however harsh. Having been served, my part in their toxic drama, the unwilling role of the long-suffering, accommodating, silently resentful mother, was definitively blessedly over. It was time to exit the stage, permanently. I nodded once, a small, decisive movement, meeting Charles's concerned gaze, and for the first time since I'd seen that ugly bruise reflected back at me in my mirror 2 days ago, I felt a tiny, fragile flicker of genuine peace begin to bloom in the cold, desolate landscape of my heart. "Yes, Charles," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears, but steady, finally steady. "Please, take me home." Charles didn't hesitate for a second. His arm was a solid, comforting, protective weight around my shoulders as he gently, firmly steered me towards the foyer, creating a silent, unbreachable path through the few remaining clusters of whispering, morbidly fascinated guests who hadn't yet managed their escape. No one dared to meet our eyes now. They were too busy pretending they hadn't witnessed the brutal social and financial execution that had just taken place, too eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. As we reached the massive front door, Crystal looked up from the floor where she was still huddled, her face streaked with tears and running mascara, her eyes wide with a final desperate, almost animalistic plea. "Mom," she choked out, taking a stumbling, half-hearted step towards me, her hand outstretched. "Don't go. Please. Stay. We can fix this. I can fix this. I'm sorry." Fix this? Could she fix the ugly, throbbing bruise on my face with a simple apology? Could she fix the years of quiet disrespect, the constant undermining, the slow, insidious erosion of my place in my own son's life? Could she fix the fundamental weakness in her own character that had allowed, even encouraged, her husband's cruelty? Could she fix the profound, almost pathological disconnect from reality that allowed her to believe, even now, that this catastrophic wreckage could somehow be fixed, glued back together with flimsy words and desperate promises? I stopped for just a moment, just inside the open doorway, the cool night air washing over my face. I looked back at my daughter, at the tangled, sobbing mess she had become, kneeling amidst the ruins of her glittering, hollow life. I saw the raw fear in her eyes, the dawning, terrifying realization of her utter aloneness, the frantic desperation of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. And a part of me, the mother part that never truly dies, the part that remembers rocking her to sleep and kissing her scraped knees, ached for her, wanted to rush back, to hold her, to offer some impossible comfort, to tell her that it would somehow, someday, be okay. But the other part, the part that had endured the months of humiliation, the part that still bore the physical, visible mark of their contempt, the part that knew that true healing requires not just apologies but consequences, accountability, hard-won change, that part held firm. To rush back now, to offer easy forgiveness, would be to negate the entire brutal lesson. It would be to enable her further, to rescue her from the necessary, painful process of confronting the truth of her own actions. Sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to fall, and trusting they have the strength, or can find the strength, to pick themselves back up. So I simply looked at her, my expression calm, perhaps inescapably sad, but utterly finally resolute. I offered no words of comfort, no false promises of reconciliation, no easy absolution. I simply held her gaze for a long, silent, heavy moment, letting the full, crushing weight of her choices, and their irreversible, devastating consequences, settle fully upon her. Then without a word I turned, and with Charles's steadying arm protectively around me, I walked out of the house, out of the party, out of the life that had been slowly suffocating me. I didn't look back. The cool night air felt clean, cleansing, like stepping out of a smoke-filled room into a fresh breeze. Charles led me silently to his waiting car, not a flashy monstrosity like Marcus's usual demo models, but a sleek, understated, dark gray sedan with a quiet driver waiting patiently behind the wheel. It was the kind of car that signaled serious old money power, the kind that doesn't need to shout its presence. He helped me gently into the back seat, the plush leather a welcome luxurious comfort after the tense unreality of the past few hours. As the car pulled away smoothly, silently from the curb, I caught one final fleeting glimpse through the rear window. Crystal was still visible, silhouetted in the brightly lit doorway of the house, a small, forlorn, solitary figure framed against the backdrop of her ruined party. Her perfect life. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had retreated further into the house to rage or despair in private. The image was stark, desolate, unforgettable, a modern tragedy playing out under the cold, indifferent glare of expensive recessed lighting. Charles reached over in the quiet darkness of the car and gently, hesitantly, took my hand. His own was warm, strong, reassuring. "It's over, Viv," he said softly, his voice full of a quiet, unwavering strength that felt like an anchor in a raging storm. "It's truly over now. You're safe." I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest, closing my eyes, feeling the bone-deep exhaustion of the past few days, the past few months, the accumulated weight of years of quiet endurance, finally wash over me in a great, shuddering wave. It wasn't just the physical ache from the bruise which still throbbed beneath my eye. It was a deeper, soul-level weariness, the fatigue of a long, bruising battle finally ended. But beneath the weariness there was also a profound, almost sacred sense of release, of a heavy, toxic, suffocating burden finally being lifted from my shoulders. The drive to the quiet, elegant hotel downtown that Charles had already arranged with his usual foresight and quiet efficiency was silent. He didn't press me for details, didn't ask intrusive questions. He knew I would tell him when I was ready, in my own time. He simply sat beside me, his hand covering mine, a solid, comforting presence in the darkness. Later, sitting by the window in the quiet luxury of the hotel suite, looking out at the glittering, indifferent tapestry of the city lights spread out below, wrapped in a soft hotel robe, a cup of hot, soothing chamomile tea, warming my hands, I finally told him everything, not just about the incident in the kitchen, not just about the party, but about the months leading up to it, the subtle digs, the escalating disrespect, Marcus's controlling temper, Crystal's heartbreaking weakness and complicity, the nursing home brochures, the overheard ultimatum. I told him the whole ugly, sordid story, my voice flat, unemotional, reciting the facts like a witness giving testimony at a trial that had already reached its conclusion. Charles listened patiently, intently, his expression growing darker, colder, stonier with each detail. When I finally finished, laying bare the full extent of their cruelty and my own quiet suffering, he was silent for a long, heavy moment, staring out the window, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrest of his chair. "I should have seen it sooner," he said finally, his voice rough with a self-reproach that was entirely undeserved. "I knew Marcus was a snake, ambitious, ruthless, fundamentally insecure. I thought Kevin, damn it, Daniel. No, Kevin is the son. I thought Kevin would be a steadying influence, that his basic decency would temper her worst instincts." He stumbled over the names, the roles, still processing the shock of the situation himself. "I never imagined he'd be so weak as to allow this, or that Crystal, my own niece, could be capable of such." He shook his head, unable to find the right word, the adequate word, for the depth of her betrayal, her casual cruelty towards her own mother. "My investment in Marcus's company," he continued after a moment, his voice regaining its familiar lawyerly precision, cold and analytical, "was always intended from the beginning as leverage. A silent safety net for you, Vivian, a discreet way to ensure he treated you, and by extension Kevin, with the basic respect and consideration you deserve. I hoped, truly hoped I'd never have to actually use it. But he forced my hand tonight. He left me no choice. What will actually happen to them now? I asked quietly, not out of any lingering concern, certainly not out of pity, but simply out of a need for closure, for the final disposition of the case. Charles sighed, running a hand wearily over his face. Financially, Marcus is likely completely ruined. As I told him, converting the note gives my holding company controlling interest. First thing Monday morning, my team will go in, conduct a full audit, which I suspect will uncover a host of other irregularities, and begin liquidating the viable assets to recoup my initial investment and pay off any outstanding corporate debts. There won't be much, if anything, left for him. He'll lose the company, certainly. Bankruptcy is a strong possibility. He paused, considering the other angles. As for the house, as I mentioned, I hold the primary mortgage note through a separate investment entity. Given his imminent loss of income and likely inability to make payments, foreclosure is now a virtual certainty. It will take a few months, legally, but the outcome is not in doubt. They will lose the house. He looked at me, his expression grim. Professionally, Marcus is finished. I'll make a quiet off-the-record call to Bob Henderson first thing tomorrow. No need for messy police reports or public lawsuits. That would only cause you more distress, but Bob will understand the situation immediately. Marcus's career in sales, at least at any reputable firm in this city or any other where Bob has influence, is effectively over. He's radioactive. He sighed again. As for their marriage, he shrugged. A gesture of weary resignation. It was built on ambition, appearances, and likely a significant amount of debt hidden from Crystal. My guess, it won't survive the catastrophic loss of all three. He'll blame her. She'll resent him. It will likely get very ugly before it's over. It was a bleak picture. A complete and utter demolition executed with the swift, silent, devastating precision of a controlled implosion. Do you regret it? Charles asked gently then, his sharp lawyer's eyes searching my face, looking for any flicker of doubt, of lingering maternal softness. Calling me tonight? Letting it all play out like that? I thought for a long moment, looking out at the distant, glittering city lights. Lights that suddenly felt cold and alien. Did I regret exposing their ugliness, their rotten core? Did I regret the catastrophic consequences they had so clearly, so definitively brought upon themselves? Did I regret finally, belatedly choosing my own safety, my own dignity, my own peace over the preservation of a toxic, one-sided, soul-destroying relationship? No, Charles, I said finally, my voice clear, steady, and utterly certain. I don't regret it, not for a second. I only regret that it ever came to this. I regret losing the daughter I thought I had, the daughter I loved. But I don't regret protecting myself, and I certainly don't regret letting the truth in all its ugly glory finally come out into the light. The echo of regret, the heavy, suffocating weight of it, I knew with absolute certainty was now theirs alone to carry. Mine was the quiet, clear, almost weightless sound of a door finally, firmly, blessedly closing on a long, painful, finished chapter, and another door somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, somewhere just for me, finally opening onto an unknown, uncertain, but finally blessedly hopeful future.